So my name is Joel Miles. I am one of the pastors at Holy Trinity Church. I've been at Holy Trinity since 2007. That's how long I've been at the church. I became a pastor in 2013 or 14, I think 14. But recently I took a step back in my role. So I'm still at the church. I'm still a pastor there, but I have a much smaller role. And people who are way more competent in things like Melissa and Sully have been kind of taking over my stuff. And I'm a full-time PhD student at Wheaton, pursuing my PhD in theology and focusing on Leslie Newbegin, which you'll hear a quote from him. Not a lot of this is coming from him, but you'll hear a quote from him in this talk. So yeah, I live in Chicago. I live on the west side in East Garfield Park. Marcelo, who said hi earlier, mentioned that he's in East Garfield Park as well, which is very true. And I miss seeing him, even though he's super close to me. I don't get to see him anymore. But I am excited to be here today to talk about this. So Sully's going to put up the slides. So this is the first time I have done this talk. These are things I have thought about quite a bit. But trying to kind of put them in a way that is understandable and that is helpful is really my goal today. And the title itself made it seem a little bit baffling. So the cultural apologetic of Christian community. But in general, what I'm seeking to do today is to convince you that whenever we are trying to defend the faith, to make the faith of Jesus Christ plausible, make sense, that while of course it is possible to do that as an individual, and we can probably think of many examples, that generally speaking, the most compelling way of actually displaying the plausibility of the Christian faith is through community. Is through actually a group of people, a local church essentially, that live as if the gospel is true. And I want to try and show why that is a remarkably important thing to understand, that not only is it biblical, but that's really important to get. So I am not Paul, who's the one who's leading this. I'm not technically an apologist, which Paul is an apologist. And so I'm not going to be getting into necessarily the nitty gritty of various things to do, but more convince you that whatever you do with apologetics, it has to actually take place within a community. I'm going to try and show you why that is really important. I'm going to begin by just talking about what apologetics is in general and make sure we understand what we're even talking about there, because I think a lot of times, and I certainly know this as someone who has been trained, has taken apologetics classes, that sometimes we can assume we know what that means and so go about it a specific way, when actually I think we often go about apologetics in the wrong way because we assume we understand what apologetics is. So simple definitions of apologetics would be something like a defense of the faith, a means by which we make Christian faith plausible. This is now the next two points here, kind of picking up on Paul's language here. So a means by which we show that the Christian faith, is true to the way the world is and true to the way the world ought to be. Or cultural apologetics, getting at kind of his language, that it's not just a cognitive thing, it's not just true, but it's a means by which we show that the Christian faith is true, good, and beautiful. Because those are some simple definitions of apologetics. And based on those definitions, which I actually think are accurate, what often happens when we start talking about this discipline is we start saying it's different than evangelism. Okay, so is apologetics and evangelism the same thing? Well, when I was trained in apologetics, it was almost always said, no, they are not the same thing. Okay, so evangelism would be defined as bearing witness to the truth, bearing witness to the faith. So evangelism is not converting people. That's the hope. We hope for that, but the Bible would tell us that's really up to God as to whose heart really gets changed and captivated by the gospel. We are to bear witness to the faith. That's what evangelism is. Apologetics is different than that, because apologetics is how we make that witness plausible. But I hope to show you that in reality, when we really understand, I think, what Christian apologetics, what cultural Christian apologetics is, that there is a lot more overlap between the two that is often noted. That true, I think, apologetics, really making the faith plausible, is significantly more similar to evangelism than we often normally think. Because I want to ask the question, how do we make something plausible? Okay, how do we do that? This, I think, is a really important question because the plausibility of something is not as straightforward as we often assume. Okay, so even certain sayings like, oh, that's common sense. We can say that as long as we recognize that common sense is according to what we as a community agree to be true. But common sense is not something you're born with. No one is born with a set of things that actually are true and not true. Common sense comes in different ways, which means that making something plausible is not as straightforward as we often assume. Why? Because what is plausible, what makes sense to me, what makes sense to you, is contingent on what you already believe to be true. Okay, so go back to Paul's words from last week, that we want to make Christianity defensible true to what the world is and to the way the world ought to be. Well, most of us, everyone actually, already has a set of things that they think are true about the world and a set of things that they think are true about what the world ought to be. Now, we might have them so deep inside us, we don't actually realize that they're beliefs. We might just assume that they are facts, is the way that our culture often puts it, but actually they're beliefs. They're things that we believe to be true. So what someone already believes, that will massively influence what one believes is plausible. So I want to take, for example, Mark 9:14 through 28 here. Okay, I basically just picked a random healing narrative from the Bible. So there's no, I didn't like pick out Mark 9 and be like, this is the thing to show you. But okay, so in Mark 9:14 through 28, you don't need to turn there. I can just kind of summarize the important points there, but if you want to, you can. So a father comes to Jesus. This is right after the transfiguration. Jesus comes down from the mountain, and a father comes to Jesus, and he starts talking to Jesus about his boy having convulsions. Okay, his son who has these things where he gets cast headlong, he starts shaking, foaming at the mouth, and then he goes really stiff. Okay, so what is happening to the boy? Well, I would guess that for many, probably most, but I'll say many modern Westerners, the answer would be epilepsy. He's an epileptic. That's what actually is happening to the boy. Now, the father does actually seem to recognize that, probably. Matthew actually says that he's epileptic, but the father attributes it not just that he has epilepsy, but that he has a demon. Okay, which modern Westerners would not think about someone just falling on the ground and starting to shake as being like, oh, they must have a demon. They wouldn't assume. That wouldn't be common sense to them. That would not be plausible. Why? Why the difference? Well, one of the main reasons for the difference is because of certain assumptions modern Westerners have compared to the father who comes to Jesus in this story. For the father in the story, he believes that demons are real, that they are active. That's an assumption. That's a prior assumption that he has when he comes to this. So when he sees this activity in his son, the plausible explanation is that he is demon possessed. So that the way to heal him then is not strictly to heal him actually of epilepsy, but to cast the demon out, which is what he comes to Jesus, well, really the disciples first, then Jesus, seeking for them to do. But for many modern Westerners, they could not accept as plausible that the boy was demon possessed, even if your explanation was something like the demon possession manifested itself through epilepsy. Because there are prior assumptions, there are beliefs beforehand that would basically be defeater beliefs, as Paul mentioned last week. There are assumptions that would actually lead to that simply not being true. Demons don't exist. So the plausible explanation cannot be that what's happening here is demon possession. Okay, so if you sought to then defend this story by simply saying, well, they're demons, that would not make any sense. That apologetic would not make any sense to a modern Westerner. Demons are not true according to what the world is. And we need to recognize this, because what this means is that when we are discussing Christian apologetics or seeking to defend the Christian faith, what we are trying to do is to make something plausible in the midst of a number of assumptions and prior beliefs. Okay? We are not coming to someone with a blank slate in their head and their heart and how they see the world, but actually coming to someone who has massive amounts of assumptions that are already there. And we all have this. Okay. This isn't just like, Non-Christians have this, but us Christians don't. It's like, no, we all have these kinds of things. We're coming to people who have an understanding of what the world is, and we're trying to defend or make plausible the Christian faith in the midst of those prior assumptions or prior beliefs. And what that means is that apologetics can really take essentially two different forms. Okay, there can be kind of two different angles that we can come to when we think about what apologetics is. On the one hand, we can seek to explain the faith of Christ in a way that makes it make sense within someone's prior assumptions. Okay? So and I'll just kind of say that usually when we do apologetics or when we try to defend the faith, we don't like consciously decide what angle am I going to take here. We just kind of do it. But that's part of the thing I'm trying to point out is like we actually need to realize that we are assuming a certain angle when we come to this. So we could come and say, okay, your assumptions, your way of seeing the world, your way of thinking what the world is accurate. Let me show you how this faith actually makes sense within that. Or we can come from a different angle, which is where we seek to defend the faith in such a way that it calls into question the assumptions of the other by offering another foundational vision of what is true of the world and what the world ought to be. Okay? So when we defend the Christian faith, either we can say, all right, your assumptions are accurate. Let me show you how these make sense of those assumptions. Or we can come and actually present it in such a way that tries to somewhat destroy or remove those assumptions and replace them with something different. The latter form of apologetics, that is what I believe Christians need to adopt. When we are seeking to defend the faith, we cannot take the first position where we come and say, your assumptions are true. Let me show you this makes sense within it. We need to adopt the latter. Okay, why? Has anyone seen, I know I can't see that many of you, especially with screens being shared, but I want some of you to put your hands up. Have any of you, Melissa knows I'm going to use this illustration, and I'm so proud of it, guys. Has anyone seen the movie Ever After? Put your hand up. You've seen the movie Ever After. Drew Barrymore is in it. It's the Cinderella story, essentially. Yep. Okay. So it essentially tells the Cinderella story. Okay. But, and this is what I think is really interesting. Yes, I recently watched this movie with my wife. So, and I enjoyed it. So it essentially tells the Cinderella story, but in a way that it's meant to make it plausible to modern audiences. Okay. Yes, Chelsea, I agree with you. Great movie. All right. So the movie begins with an old woman who calls the Brothers Grimm to her almost kind of deathbed, but to her so that she can talk to them. So the Brothers Grimm, they're the famous brothers who collected all these different fairy tales and published them. Okay, so she calls them to them, and they've already published the Cinderella story. All right, so they're already famous. They've come out with all their fairy tales, but she wants to explain actually the true story of Cinderella to the Brothers Grimm. Okay, so they published it. I have never read the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella, but I assume it's way weirder and darker than Disney. But there'll be a lot of fantastical elements, I assume, within it. There'll be magic in it and stuff like that. She wants to explain the true story because she actually is Cinderella. Okay, so she explains the story, and so the whole movie basically is telling the story of Cinderella in a way that's meant to make it plausible. But think about what does it take to make that story believable? What do you need to do? What did the writers of Ever After have to do? Well, they had to strip it of all the supernatural elements. Yeah, you had to remove the magic. You had to get rid of all these different things. You had to get rid of all that, like there's no fairy godmother. It actually is like Da Vinci or something like that. I can't remember. Maybe no, I think it's Da Vinci. Michelangelo, I think, is back in Italy. So Da Vinci is there. So you have to strip it of all these different elements that would make it too fantastical. It has to be disenchanted. And then it's believable as, oh, that actually could happen. There's no magic, no talking animals, etc. Actually, Cinderella and the prince didn't fall in love in one night. They had to know each other beforehand, all these kind of things like that. But while, I mean, it's not that big of a deal because it's Cinderella, who really cares? If we're being honest, like that, okay, it actually has changed the story. It's no longer the same story. It's a change in such a way that it could be believable to us. And you see, that is actually why Christianity, true Christianity, as it is presented to us in the scriptures, cannot be defended in a kind of way that it makes it make sense according to our prior assumptions. Because if that is what we are seeking to do, we will end up having to strip it of everything that we would assume cannot be accurate, cannot be true. Now, I want you to hear me correctly here. I'm not saying through this that we just need to approach the gospel free of all culture. Okay, I think there's a way that you can kind of hear me saying this, like, we just need to come to the Bible and not assume anything with the culture and just read it and interpret it. Because honestly, if I was saying that, you should be like, that doesn't make any sense. That's literally impossible for anyone to do. And it's almost like the epitome of pride to think that you can come to the gospel and not be influenced by your culture in any kind of way. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, however, is that our defense of the gospel cannot begin by seeking to make it make sense according to the reigning ways that our culture sees the world. Okay, so think about it. So last week, Paul described our culture using 3 words. Right. So the first one was disenchanted. Okay, so it's a disenchanted world. When we look at the world, it's material. And that's it. We don't see things beyond it. We don't kind of think that there's like spirits behind or something like that. It is a disenchanted world. It's also sensate, meaning that we know things based on our senses. So we come to know things by touch, by taste, by feel, all those kind of things like that. And then thirdly, it's hedonistic, okay, which really gets at kind of the purpose of what we think our lives is about. The purpose is pleasure, doing things that actually make you feel good or something like that. That's how our culture, the Western culture, generally speaking, I know that's really general, sees the world. It's a disenchanted world. It's sensate. It's hedonistic. Okay, that's what the world is. These are the underlying assumptions of our culture. Okay, that are not just things that we don't even cognitively always know we think this is true. These are the assumptions. These are like deep down in our gut. So think about trying to defend the faith within these assumptions. In our culture that's disenchanted, sentient, and hedonistic, how do you make sense of a message that not only says that a man died and rose again, but that his death and resurrection atoned for the sins of the world, and that following his pattern of life, which means taking up your cross to follow him, is truly living the way you're supposed to live? How do you make that make sense? How do you defend that in a world that assumes that things can only really be known by your senses, that there's nothing really beyond what we can actually see, and that the world is about pleasure? That's what life is really about. Well, really, you can't actually make that plausible. You can't present that message as plausible unless it's a new way of seeing the world, unless we present it as a whole new way of knowing what is true and what the world ought to be. Because frankly, and so here's where Newbegin is going to come in, as Newbegin would often say, the resurrection from the dead and the cross of Jesus Christ do not make sense in any worldview except for those that have them as their starting point for how they see everything. Okay? Now, I want you to notice that when I said that, I did not say it does not make sense in any worldview except for the one that has it as its starting point. Because there are different ways that Christians will actually kind of see the world with this as a starting point, and they assume that we can come to the perfect worldview. I think there is one, but I think Jesus is the only one who had it. And Paul probably came pretty close, and the rest of the apostles. But even then, we would say they couldn't see things perfectly. Jesus is the only one who could really actually do this. The rest of us are seeking to do it. But we have to understand that Christianity actually offers a brand new foundation for how we see everything. And the cross and resurrection are the new starting point then. And so you see, this is the true work of apologetics, not to defend the faith as making sense according to how others see the world, but to present to others a new way of seeing the world that makes better sense than the one they currently hold to. Okay? And this is why Paul's cultural apologetics, not Paul the Apostle, Paul Gold, who was talking last week, this is why Paul's cultural apologetics is so important, because, again, what he's saying here is that we're not just displaying the truth of it, as if it's just, oh, we'll just kind of cognitively get it and it'll be fine. But can we actually present Christianity in such a way that people start to be captured by the beauty of it, by the goodness of it, that they actually see it and they long for it in some kind of way, rather than simply saying, okay, yeah, we can see why maybe it's true or how it fits into my rating plausibility structure. But how do you do that? How do you actually present the gospel in such a way that we are captured by its vision of life? Well, Paul, again, will get more into the specifics of that in the next 2 weeks. What I want to highlight today is that this is best done, or perhaps even only truly done, through a community that believes it, that embodies this way of life, through the local church. That true apologetics in this way is a communal endeavor. Okay, so I want to ask, what do I mean by this? Well, okay, so when I was growing up, I always went to summer camp. Okay, so I grew up in a Christian home. I don't think I became a Christian until I was 17. Now, yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home, didn't become a Christian till I was 17. Now, before that, I was not a particularly rebellious kid. I think I like to think of myself as a really rebellious kid, but I wasn't really all that rebellious. But during high school, I essentially lived like all of my friends around me. Yeah, that was essentially the way I lived. My life just looked the same. So I lived a life that was pretty much committed to hedonism and all the stuff that comes along with that. But each summer, being in a Christian family that wanted me to believe the Bible, wanted me to follow Christ, they always sent me to a summer Bible camp called Joy Bible Camp. And each week I was there, I, basically like everyone else, was a very committed Christian. Okay, so I'd live like all my friends in high school while I was at home, and then I'd go to camp, and I was a very committed Christian while I was at camp. But I don't just mean, and this is important, I don't just mean that I acted this way to fit in. I don't just mean it's like, oh, I might as well just act like this because that's the kind of the best way to get through this week. No, when I was there, I fully believed. I wanted God. I would cry hearing the gospel. I would worship him. I was convinced that living for him was the best way and the true way to actually live life. I was completely committed to bearing my cross and serving others and glorifying the Lord. But I would leave and I returned to life in high school, surrounded by my friends, and I became wrapped up in that way of life again. You know, why did that happen? Why the difference? And it's very common when I talk to people who went to Bible camp and went to public school and stuff like that. They're like, yeah, that was me too. So I don't have some kind of unique story. Why? Well, I'm sure we could give a lot of different reasons why this happened, but the main reason, I think, was the community around me. These different communities embodied for me different ways of living, different directions of life, different understandings of what life is and should be about. And in so doing, they displayed for me what was plausible. They showed me what made sense. And so my life would just go in that kind of direction. It wasn't that someone explained it to me. In fact, when I was at home, I wanted to actually live for the Lord. I was still like in my head convinced of the gospel. I wanted my life to be about that, but the community around me convinced me that that wasn't worth it. It wasn't plausible. It didn't make sense that actually living this kind of hedonistic, disenchanted, sensate way, that was actually what was true and what must actually be the best way of living. But when I was at camp, I was convinced, absolutely convinced, that this way of life was good, right, and worth it. And this is because, this might be a weird thing to actually think about, communities give meaning to things. That things don't, I mean, the gospel does have meaning apart from a community because God gives it meaning. God is the community essentially who gives his word its meaning. But if you think about how things come to mean something, it is actually through societies, through groups of people, through communities that give meaning to them. So we have up here on the slides, language, sports, and laws. I want you to think about all three of these, okay? So think about a language. Have you ever heard two people in a conversation who are speaking a language that you do not know? And you just feel like it sounds like gibberish. You're like, I don't, like, that just sounds like nothing. It's just like random sounds that are coming out. Well, that's because that's actually what words are, apart from the communities that use them. So words do not have meaning in and of themselves. They are just sounds. What gives them meaning is that we, as a community, use them in a meaningful way. So right now, I am just having sounds come out of my mouth. And yet we all understand that these distinct sounds, when used in this kind of way, used with this intonation, all that kind of stuff like that, it means something. And so we interpret it in that kind of way. You actually give my words essentially meaning in some kind of way by interpreting them according to our communal understanding of them. Okay. And so what makes it plausible to those who do not speak English that these sounds have meaning is the community that uses it. Right. So if you're from the outside, you're looking in, and you just hear these gibberish sounds, you're like, well, I know that must mean something. Why? Because there's a group of people that actually show me that it means something. They seem to be communicating. And so actually, as a community, they're showing that it's plausible that those sounds have actually something more than just what I'm hearing. Okay, or think about sports. I mean, I'm a big sports fan, so I do love kind of ripping on sports a little bit, though, when we think about it. Like, imagine trying to convince someone from 500 years ago that it really matters if you are able to bounce an orange ball and throw it into a basket hung exactly 10 feet high. Like, that explanation would just be so confusing. They would be like, what are you talking about? And yet, with my kids, I have never had to sit them down and explain that, just so you know, sports matter. Okay, if you're really good at sports, you can get paid a ton of money. Why? Well, because our culture, the community that they're in, has shown them repeatedly that there's apparently so much meaning in these kinds of things. We have a community that actually just decided, essentially, that this is what we are going to be committed to. We're going to think these things are kind of important. Or laws, for example. Laws have meaning because we as a community treat them as having meaning. Okay, which is why when we go to different countries, the laws aren't there and for certain things. As a community, we actually give these understandings, these ways of living life, meaning through actually living together in that kind of way. You see, this is why we really need, so this I understand is why I don't need to tell my kids again that the world is disenchanted, sensate, or hedonistic. If I want to convince them of that, I can just have them live in this culture, live in this community. They will be convinced of it because our world is showing them that this is what's true. That's what's plausible. So how do I then defend the faith against that? Defend the Christian faith against that way of seeing the world? No matter how we answer that question, part of it has to include the importance of a local community of people who actually seek to live as if the gospel is true, who embody in their communal life together the idea that what Jesus did on the cross is the meaning of history. The idea that actually taking up your cross and following Jesus is living the good life. A community that does that together will actually show to the world that this is plausible, that this actually could make sense. Not because they can fit it into their way of seeing the world, but because they can look at it and see that actually maybe that way of living is better than this way of living. It actually then can defend the faith in a way that actually moves to the side these assumptions that are so deep inside. In fact, I want to mention a question that was posed last week in the chat to everyone that we did not address. It was asked in response to, so Paul did a really great job kind of outlining all the different problems in our culture right now with the church and how many people are leaving the church. And basically it was just like doomsday, just like everyone's leaving. So what are we going to do about it? And one of my dear friends put in the chat, do you think, quote, do you think part of the problem of people leaving the faith is that it doesn't seem relevant to the life as they are experiencing, end quote. And I think the answer to that question is a resounding, well, yes, definitely. But we really need to be careful on how we seek to remedy that. Because what can happen in our hope of making sure our preparation or our presentation of the faith is relevant to people is that we present Christianity as being the best answer to the life as they think it should be, which is very compelling. It will make Christianity super compelling to people in our culture because, okay, think about it. If our culture is saying that life is about pleasure, it's about accomplishing your dreams, about achieving who you're always meant to be, it's about being true to yourself, accepting who you are so you can be the best version of yourself. If that's what our culture assumes is true, and then we come and say, God wants you to live your best life now, that God's love for you is so big that he accepts fully who you are and doesn't want you to change, but rather to be more fully who you were meant to be and accept who you are, that message is going to sound extremely compelling to our culture because living in our society has already convinced us that that's what's true. But if you come and proclaim that you are a sinner who needs grace, that Jesus died on the cross for you, so that yes, you could come as you are, but be radically changed by grace, to live a life that's not about yourself at all, but rather about worshiping God and serving others, and that living that way is truly free, that will make no sense to people in our world. It will not seem plausible. It will not be attractive unless they see a community of people who are living as if that's true, who show through embodying that way of life that this is not only possible, but it's better, that it's good, that it's wonderful. And if as a community, it seems so simple, but if as a community, we basically live as if the gospel is true, we will be, as someone has put in the chat, salt and light. We will actually compel people by that very reality to say, that must actually be possible to believe. That must be possible to live that kind of way. And so my point basically in saying this is to say that as we think about apologetics, it can be very easy to somewhat individualize and to say, okay, I'm just trying to figure out these arguments I need to have. And there's a lot of truth to that. There are good arguments and stuff like that. And there's, and I want us to get that. But part of it also is that if you want to compel people, part of it is to show them who you are with. And so part of the call then to us as well is to say, are we living a life that shows the gospel is true? And are we doing it with others as well? Are we seeking to actually be inside of that community? Because in doing so we will display to the world that there actually is a better way than being disenchanted, sensate, and hedonistic. That we actually display that there is a life that oddly comes at sacrifice and yet gives you everything. Okay, so that's the talk. I'd love to open it up to questions. I know you guys can send it into Melissa, and I assume some questions have probably already come in as well.
Yeah, definitely would love to hear any more questions that you guys have. Feel free to send those in. Thank you so much, Joel. I think it is really compelling, and even just as I was saying before, I think it matters so much in sort of our cultural moment right now. One question is, how do we fight against sort of the question that, or the idea that would come up of like, well, I see that that's working for you and that's good for you, but like I'm good with what I'm doing. That's nice that that's the, you know, plausibility structure that you're living in, but I'm fine. How do you kind of think about that?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, so people are going to think that that's a very normal thing to think in our culture. I think one of the first things we need to recognize is that we as Christians can't buy into that as well. There's a lot of times I feel like we have to do that as well. We're like, you know, well, some of you have heard me say this so many times. So I just looked at Sully and thought he was smiling at me, but his camera's off. It's like, I know what you're going to say. But so a lot of times what we want to actually say is things like, well, I believe in Jesus, but that's just my opinion. And when we do that, what we actually do, we are kind of undercutting the claim of the gospel. We're kind of actually essentially taking a claim. So the gospel is a universal public claim that Jesus is Lord over all things. Okay, which means we can't just think that he is good for me. That's completely antithetical to the gospel. So one of the ways I think we actually need to recognize how we come against that is to not actually say that back to the person. There's people are going to think that, people are going to say that kind of thing, but we need to be careful in our culture to realize that if we back away from this idea, we're actually completely buying into that, because our culture has an assumption that it's okay for there to be multiple different truths. Okay, now that is our culture's universal truth as well. And that's an important thing to kind of recognize. It's not like our culture. So this is Newbigin's really want to help me so much with this kind of thing. But thinking about pluralism is in so many ways our reigning plausibility structure. Okay, so it assumes that there are actually multiple different opinions about about truth, but in so doing, that is an overarching belief over all things. All right. So when someone says that, they're actually showing you kind of this universal claim that they have as well, that it's just okay for us to do different things. That's fine for them to think that. Our response, though, in some ways needs to be that that's great that you think that way. I just, when I say that Jesus is not just for me, he actually is for all. And we need to live as if that's true. If we don't do that, then we're giving up the ground that the gospel actually claims by being a universal truth and giving it to their universal truth, their claim to universal truth.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So it might not be in the moment convincing them that they're wrong, but it's holding our ground that there aren't just various different ways that you could choose to understand what's true.
Yeah. Well, and I think that this is why, so I forgot to mention this in the talk, but I think this is why we need to recognize that apologetics is actually, there's so much overlap with evangelism, because what we are so much often doing in trying to defend the faith is essentially just present the faith. But we're not just trying to like just beat someone's argument down, because part of the problem with even that kind of idea is that if we're just trying to beat someone's argument down, often what we're going to do is we're going to have to assume the same things that they assume. And as soon as we do that, we've kind of lost the ground that the gospel claims. The gospel claims to be a universal claim. It is the foundation upon which all truth is built. And so if that's true, we have to recognize in these conversations, we have to be willing just to present it. Yes, we can make it seem plausible according to certain things. But we need to be careful in how we do that we can often then undermine the very gospel itself by doing so.
That's good. There's some good questions coming in right now too. Even some specific questions about the community, which I think it'd be great to just dig into a little bit more. So one question are, what you think are good steps to develop and educate a clearly defined biblical worldview in our community? How do we let's see, best steps to develop and educate into a clearly defined biblical worldview in our community? So how can we help do that?
Well, so one, this is super hard to do in COVID. COVID makes this extremely hard to do. So let's just recognize that of all the times to use the community to present the gospel, this is one of the most difficult. However, the COVID will not last forever. And it is, I think, really important to help us recognize that living together, not necessarily in the same house, is so significant. It is not enough just to attend church for an hour and a half, 2 hours on Sunday, and then to kind of go home and be like, okay, there was my communal apologetic. It is our common lives together. So you think about Jesus saying, they will know you are Christians. Well, it doesn't say Christians, but they will know you are my followers by your love for one another. What does that imply? Well, that implies that people are going to see you together. It's not going to be some kind of distant love where you're just in a conversation saying, well, I'm not going to be like, well, I love Sully. People are like, wow, you must be a Christian. It's actually by seeing our common lives together. And so that's a really significant thing. In terms of educating yourself, there's so many different resources, but one, I would say being committed to your church, being committed to hearing the word preached on Sundays, being committed to praying together, because a Christian, a fully developed, or the wording that was used, a Christian worldview is not just developed by kind of just knowing the right things. It is developed by actually a life together that is actually seeking to pray and think through these things together, because how it gets applied in different situations is going to change significantly, and you have to work that out with those around you. So to just give a quick example, a number of years ago, I moved to the same neighborhood with a bunch of different friends. And it was one of the most formative times of my life. We spent tons of time together. Now, at the time, we were a lot younger. We had very few responsibilities, so we could spend a lot more time together. But that moment was one of the greatest evangelistic times of my life, not because I was just constantly sharing the gospel with others, but because people who were coming into our community that was inviting over just to hang out were able to see just how we live together and be convinced by it. So there was a guy named Jimmy who became a Christian, And we had shared the gospel explicitly with him multiple times. But it was actually, he told us, through seeing us pray together, that convinced him of the truth of it. Now, if he just saw us pray together, he wouldn't have become a Christian. He wouldn't have been like, the cross must be true, because he wouldn't know the cross. He needed to have the verbal explanation of it. And yet it was confirmed, it was made plausible through a group of people doing these kinds of things together. And it was through this kind of commitment that we made. And I think thinking through, how do I make if my life is to be, we're going to show that this is plausible, so often our lives, where we live, all those kind of things are directed by what our world tells us is right. We move for our jobs, we try to find somewhere that's comfortable and stuff like that. I'm not saying it's wrong to be comfortable or to move for your job, but often we need to think through, am I just doing this for money? Am I just doing this for pleasure? Is it possible actually that if the gospel is the foundation, I may move for a different reason? I may move to be closer to other people. I may move to actually have a community around me that I can struggle through life with. Or I may not move because I've got this church here that I'm so a part of, and they love me, and I'm able to actually kind of show the gospel through my life with them. Those are, I think, are significant things to take into account in the midst of all of this.
Yeah, it's helpful. A lot of questions coming in about kind of how do we become the kind of community, or how do we live in community in a way that does invite that kind of observation or engagement with us.
Yeah.
I think one question that's helpful, even as we are coming at this from a work perspective, what are things that we can do if we're maybe the only Christian in our workplace, or that we don't have a community of believers that are there, or maybe even in this time of COVID where we're living in isolation?
Yeah. And I think first of all, recognize that you're not in sin if you are the only one who's a Christian at your workplace. You're like, I don't have the community around me to kind of like display this. You're not in sin if you're isolated right now or something like that. So Bonhoeffer's Life Together is helpful in thinking about this, especially his first chapter. I think it's his first chapter. Melissa can probably correct me if it's the wrong one. But he just talks about we need to be really careful of being too idealistic with community, and recognize it's such a gift when you have it, but that God won't always give it to you. So I don't want what I presented today to all of a sudden be this like guilt trip, like, oh my gosh, I haven't been able to find this community, I must be in the wrong, or something like that. The Lord places you where he places you. That community that I had when we all lived in Bridgeport together, we don't all live in Bridgeport anymore. And that was for that season, and now we're in different stages. So if you are the only person in your workplace, I think first of all, just recognize that that's just the position that the Lord has you in, and that's okay. That being said, I do think that one of the things is important to recognize is if you are the only person in your workplace, this is always true, but it's really important to be deeply rooted in a church and at the same time. Because if you're the only Christian at your workplace, or you're kind of isolated, even if you're one or two or something like that, that community that surrounds you then, where you spend most of your time, is going to have a massive shaping effect on you. And so being committed then to a church in the midst of that is really important, because it is true that God can use an individual to display these things, can use you to defend the faith through what you say and through what you do. And so recognizing that, I do think is important, that you can do it as an individual, but also then recognize that one of the most important ways you can present the gospel to someone is not to make sure that you are the one who's able to just do it. Like, oh man, do I know the gospel so well that when they ask me, I'm ready to just kind of nail them with it and say it perfectly. But it's also just to say, again, hard to do during COVID, but do you want to come to church with me on Sunday? Or just talking about it. Or when you hang out with people from your church community or something like that, inviting one or two over. And that doesn't mean that person then becomes the project when they arrive and all your church friends there being like, there's the potential convert. No, it actually is just seeing you in community. And so I think part of it is just doing your best to be open with your life to others and inviting people in. And again, just recognizing that you are not in control of whether or not someone believes you or not. I can maybe be convincing at different times to people. You can be convincing at different times to people, but you really can't change someone's heart. I really need the Lord to do that. And so resting in that, but also seeking to say, okay, how do I actually do this just in small ways? I think Keller has talked about that one of the most important steps to take at church, at in telling people about Christianity or something like that is just to tell them that you attend church. That's a great start. Then they're kind of pricked to that idea that, okay, if I see something different, maybe that's because of something. Maybe that's because they go to church or something like that, which can open the door in different ways. But yeah, it certainly is a challenge. And I wouldn't know it as well as you do because I'm a pastor. So I have happened to have at least one or two other Christians with me at my workplace. We're still questionable about Sully, but fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think one of the points that you bring up and that maybe is being kind of asked in some of the questions is, I mean, in some ways, it's just, it's the community around us that helps us live a life that is different, that isn't shaped by just what the people around us think or what the culture thinks. And so in some ways, there's this whole community behind us that's helping us say, no, it's possible for me to actually live in a way that fights against, whatever the world thinks about power or money or sexuality. I am surrounded by people who are holding me up in that and helping me to believe that and live that out and proclaim something that's countercultural. Maybe it's in my workplace, maybe it's not because other people are around me right there, but because it's something that I'm living out in my life. I even saying something like, I go to church on Sunday morning, I'm attending a small group tonight, so I'm not going to go out, whatever that means. That is a very counter-cultural thing to do or even to say. And so, yeah, for us, it's having a community that's making that possible for me to live out.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Let's see, one more question here that got highlighted a couple of times, I think, is just, the individuality, high desire for individualism in our culture makes it hard, to be accountable to one another, where we're bringing up disagreements. And obviously that's true in our current cultural moment again. So I guess some of this continues to be related to how do we build that kind of community? What does that, what does that investment look like? How do we persevere in that?
Yeah, so part of it is going to be somewhat just on us to be willing to actually share. So when I moved into Bridgeport with this group of people, we wrote a covenant, which is a little extreme, but we wrote a covenant to kind of say, this is what we're going to act like toward one another. Here's what we're going to do in terms of giving people the benefit of doubt, talking through things and stuff like that. Now, I am not necessarily suggesting that all of you go and write a covenant with your friends around you and then sign it and stuff like that. But most churches have membership vows. And that's really what a membership vow is. It is a covenant where you are committing to do certain things, committing to submit to the leadership, committing to be part of the community, to do that. And I would say one is to take that really seriously. That is it's a gift that God has given to us, that we can be members of churches that hold us accountable. It seems really clear from Matthew 16 and Matthew 18 that God has actually given the keys of the kingdom to the church, which Matthew 18 shows us has to be considered as local. We don't need to gather the whole church universal together to decide on discipline matters or something like that. But he's done it in such a way that we can be cared for. So in Matthew 18, Jesus talks about if someone sins against you, go tell him to his face, and then he keeps on saying, then keep on going, stuff like that. A lot of times, some of you heard me talk about this, a lot of times we treat that passage as like 3 steps to kick someone out of your church. But actually, the story Jesus says right before he says that is the parable of the lost sheep. Okay? And the question that Peter asks right after Jesus says this is, how many times do I need to forgive my brother? Is it 7 times? And Jesus says, no, I don't say 7, but 70 times 7. And so what Jesus is actually saying is, you pursue them, you pursue them, you pursue them. Yes, sometimes they get to a point where they're no longer part of the community. But I want to take that back and think about then the significance of what it means to be part of a church. It is a gift that God has given to us to then have people who would go after us, who would know our lives so well that when we've gone astray, they would be able to approach us about it to actually pull us back into the fold, to go and catch us, to forgive us when we've done different things. Now, in our individualistic culture, got the word right there, Melissa, in our individualistic culture, we have a really hard time with that because we don't like being vulnerable. We don't like sharing things. Even so, I'm someone who a lot of people think is really vulnerable, but I'm really aware of the fact that I'm super selective of what I'm vulnerable about in such a way that I can control your image of me. I want you to think I'm vulnerable without really sharing the dark things that would make me feel really actually scared. And yet that's the gift of the church, to be a people who are founded on someone dying for your forgiveness. And if that's true, if that's the community, then we should be able to be part of communities where we can share and be forgiven. Now, I know that's really scary because our culture is probably it's at least up there being one of the worst of all time, at being able to forgive one another. We have a difficult time with it. You did something 20 years ago, we're getting rid of you. Like there's a lot of that, but to be in a community where you're saying like, you know what, I'm going to be vulnerable because my confidence is in Christ. My confidence is actually in who he is and the fact that he has died for me and saved me. If that's true, then we should be able to be vulnerable and asking others to do that with you as well. I'm lucky enough to have some people that are like that, but I learned it from them as well. They were vulnerable with me, so I was able to be vulnerable with them. Yeah.
That's great. There's so much we could say about community and life together. I do think Bonhoeffer's book is really helpful in this as well. Thank you so much, Joel. Thanks everybody for joining us. I think this has been great. There's so much more that we could say on this topic, even just of community and in sharing the gospel or making the gospel plausible in our culture today. We've been taking this topic from this book written by Dr. Paul Gould. If you were with us last week, we talked about it a little bit, but he wrote a book on cultural apologetics, and he's going to be back with us next week and do the final 2 talks in this series. So just want to remind you, if you haven't had a chance to look at that, there is a code for 40% off that's in the email that I'm sharing with you as well. We do have a number of events coming up this winter, and you can find all that information at faithandworkchicago.com. But thank you guys so much for joining us this lunch break. We hope to see you next week. We're really thankful for you, and we'll be praying for you as you go about your work this week. So thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you again soon.